Like record. Yep.
Okay, I think it should work now. So let's take a look at the Mishnah. On Daf Lamed Tes. There are two Mishnayos on Daf Lamed Tes. And we'll start with the top Mishnah, which starts with the word Hagacheles. Yeah? Okay. This Mishnah deals with the halacha of Tchum, which applies both to Shabbos and to Yontif as well. What's the halacha of Tchum? A person is Kodesh Shvisa, and that sets up a certain parameter or circumference of an area where he's allowed to take an object up to that area, but not beyond. And that's called Konesh Shvisa. So the man was Konesh Shvisa, and Gacheles, which is charcoal, that has the same din, the same status as any object, which means that it is limited to what's called Kiragle Habaylim. That's the tchum up to which you're permitted to take the Gacheles. He was Konesh Shvisa at location X, and that's called Kiragle Habaylim. So the Gacheles could only be taken within a tchum of that Ragle Habaylim. So for example, let's say he would lend the Gacheles to a friend of his. His friend would only be permitted to take that Gacheles up to the tchum of Ragle Habaylim, but not beyond. But what's most important for us is the case of Shalheves. Shalheves, which is the flame itself, Bechol Makom. What is the underlying principle? Shalheves in Kol HaTorah Kula, we'll see it as it applies in many, many different areas of halacha. It's called a davar shein bo mamish. It's a gas. It's not an object. It's not material. And therefore, there's no specific place or location where it's kone l'tchum. Person has a lit, then anyone, not just the Bailim, can take that fire anywhere, and he can carry it beyond the tchum, because Shalheves is a davar shein bo mamish. Let's see how this applies in other areas of halacha. For example, with regard to Hegdesh, Gacheles shal Hegdesh mo'alim bo. If a person enjoys the benefit of a Gacheles and it has the status of Hegdesh, that's called Me'ilah, and he has to bring a carbon Me'ilah. We'll soon see that a carbon Me'ilah requires a Hanov Shava Pruta. But okay, let's assume he had a Shava Pruta Hanov from the Gacheles, and he used the Gacheles to bake or to roast his own hamburgers, so he has to bring a carbon Me'ilah. But V'shalheves, Lo Nenim, which is a D'Rabbanan, the Rabbanan said that you're not allowed to benefit from a Shalheves of Hegdesh, but V'lo Mo'alim, if he went ahead and he violated this Isa D'Rabbanan, and he was Nene from a Shalheves, there's no Me'ilah. And therefore he doesn't have to bring a carbon Me'ilah because the Shalheves is Ein Bo Mamish. Here's another example from Meleches Hotzah on Shabbos. Hamotzi Gacheles, person carries a Gacheles from his own private domain, Rishus HaYach, Rishus HaRabim, Chayav. He violated Meleches Hotzah. But the Shalheves, if he was Motzi a Shalheves, Potur, because the Shalheves is Ein Bo Mamish. It's not a material physical substance that has any substance to it. The Gemara says, Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Beitza, Chamisha Dvarim Nemru b'Gacheles. We'll apply the status of Gacheles as a contrast to Shalheves in 5 different areas. Number 1, Tchumen, Gacheles Kiragli Abaylim, Shalheves B'chol Mokum. Number 2, Gacheles Shal Hegdesh, Mo'alim Bo Shalheves, Lo Nenim V'lo Mo'alim. Now a Gacheles Shal Avodah Zarah. You have an idol worshiper, and he worshipped as part of his ceremony a fire that comes forward from a coal, from charcoal. And that is a violation of the Isur Hanoah, because Avodah Zarah, which generates an Isur Hanoah for any Mishamsheh, anything that's used in the context of the idol worship, based on a pasuk in Dvarim Yud Gimel, v'lo yidbak b'yodcha mu'uma min acherem. And therefore, he violated the Isur Hanoah of Avodah Zarah. He benefited from a gacheles that was used in the context of a cult. However, the fire Zarah, muteres manoah, he's allowed to benefit from it. It's a davar she'ein bo mamish. Number 4, hamotze gacheles shesarabim chayav shall have his pot. I don't know why the Beitza feels compelled to write this halacha basically twice. No, we didn't have it yet here in the Beitza. We had it in the Mishnah. My mistake. Number 4. Oh, that was number 4. So we had Tchumen, we have Hegdesh, we have Avodah Zarah, and we have Hotzah. Now number 5. Hamudar hanoah mechavera. If I take a neder that I will not benefit from my friend, or alternatively, my friend put a neder on me, enjoining me from having any benefit from him, asur b'gacheles u'mutar b'shaleves. The neder is only chal on a davar sheish bo mamish, which is the gacheles, and not on the shalheves, which is the davar shein bo mamish. What I don't understand is why the Gemara doesn't mention here the law of gzela. Like, for example, if I steal your gacheles, I have to pay you for that. If I steal your shalheves, it's a davar shein bo mamish. I don't have to pay you for that. But maybe that's included on the me'ilah, because me'ilah is basically gzela. So the Gemara now asks the following kasha on the Beitza. If shalheves is a davar shein bo mamish, and there's no chalos Isur Hanoah on a davar shein bo mamish, Ma'ishna shalheves avodah zarah desharya, Ma'ishna dehegdish dasire. If you have a shalheves of avodah zarah, you're allowed to benefit from it. It's a davar shein bo mamish, and there's no chalos Isur Hanoah. But yet we said in hegdesh, the law is lo nenim. You're not lechatchila. You're not permitted to get any hanoah from a shalheves of hegdesh. And both of them are doraisas, whether it's avodah zarah or hegdesh. And you should say consistently that you're allowed to get hanoah from a shalheves on a doraisa level. Ella, what the chachamim made a gzeira that you shouldn't benefit from a shalheves because you might come to benefit from a gacheles. If they made that gzeira in hegdesh, why didn't they make the parallel analogous gzeira in avodah zarah? Moran says avodah zarah de me'isa. A Jew naturally feels that avodah zarah is repulsive, ubedile inshimine, and he intuitively, naturally separates himself and distances himself from avodah zarah. Lo gazu be'rabbanan. The Rabbanan were not afraid that if we permit him to benefit from a shalheves of avodah zarah, he's going to be tempted to benefit from the gacheles itself. You imagine a little altar of the idol worshippers, but a hegdesh, the low moetz. He's not in any way repulsed by hegdesh, and therefore lo b'dila b'nei inshik. A person is not going to separate himself the way he would be from avodah zarah. He doesn't have that natural feeling of stay away, And therefore, Gazu Bei Rabbana, the Rabbana were afraid that if we allow him to have Hana from Shalheves of Hegdesh, he will perhaps have Hana from Gacheles Shal Hegdesh. The Mishnah says, Amotzi Gacheles Ushsaramim Chayav Shalheves Potav Tanya. We have a Beitza, Hamotzi Shalheves Kolshu. If a person carries a Shalheves and he relocates it, even if it's a small Shalheves, Chayav, he's violating Meleches Hotzah. And that's a direct contradiction to our Mishnah that says he's potter. Shalheves is a davar shein bo mamish. Here in the Beitza it says that Amotzi Shalheves Kolshu Chayav. Omer Rav Sheshes, the Beitza that says Yechayev for carrying a Shalheves Kigon Shotzia Bekesam. He didn't carry a Shalheves or blow a Shalheves over the boundary between one Rishus and another, but rather there was a Shalheves that was attached to a kesam, to a torch, a piece of wood. So he's holding on to the kesam, carrying the Shalheves. Well, wait a minute. If he's holding on to the kesam, then he should be chayav for carrying the kesam. What difference it make whether Shalheves has a chiyuv or doesn't have a chiyuv? Tepukle mishum kesam. Leave out the fact that there's a Shalheves. He's chayav for carrying a kesam. And the Gemara answers, but a lesle shiura. We're going to apply a principle called integration. What do I mean by integration? What I mean is that sometimes in a Meleches Hotzah, if you carry two different objects and each one has less than a shear, we can integrate the two of them to form a shear for which he's chayav. So, for example, the kesam itself has less than a shear. Again, the Gemara is now assuming a premise that there's a shear in kesam. Pretty soon we're going to question that premise. But right now, Basher Sham, that's the Gemara's premise. I don't know exactly what the shear of kesam would be. Maybe it has to be a size that he can clean his teeth, as a toothpick. I don't know. More likely it should be a size that he would use to fuel his oven so that he could bake something in the oven or cook something in the oven. Anyway, so what happens here? The kesam does not have a shear of hotzah, the minimum shear. However, if you integrate the Shalheves, then he's chayav for both the kesam and the Shalheves. So if, let's say, the kesam is a half a shear, the other half a shear is supplemented by the Shalheves. It's very interesting when you think about measuring the volume of a Shalheves. I mean, Shalheves is a davar shein bo mamish. How would you even imagine a shear in Shalheves? But I guess it has to do with the dimensions. The fire goes up so many inches, it goes to the west and to the east, it spreads out so many inches. So the Gemara now actually addresses our question. How do we know that a kesam has a minimum shear for Meleches Hotzah? Disnan, we learned in a Mishnah on Pei Tes Amid Beis in Masechet Shabbos, Hamotzi Eitzim. On Shabbos, he was carrying logs of wood. And the Mishnah addresses the question of Kama Yotzi V'Yischayev. How many Eitzim did he carry and violate, therefore, the Malach of Hotzah? And the answer is, Kidei Levashal Beitza Kala. The amount, or shall we call it the volume, of a log or a tree, piece of wood, that it would take to set up a fire, if we burnt it, that would last long enough to cook an egg. And this is all based on a premise called Beitzas Tarnagoles Memaheres Lisbashel. The Gemara goes as far as to say is you could put an egg on a hot tin roof and the sun will beat down and cook the egg. Here, he is burning a fire, putting the egg on top of the fire, and it cooks. How much of a combustible size of wood does he need to get a fire in order to cook a Beitza kala, an egg from a chicken? It doesn't take that long, and therefore a very small kisam would be sufficient. But it does have to have a shear, and the shear is kedei levashel Beitza kala. He says in the footnote that ain't tzarich sheyeh bo shear levashel as kol habeitza, el levashel kishir grogeres mimena. That he could cook a grogeres' worth of beitza with that limited small amount of a kisam that will burn a very small fire. Bottom line is, when you have a gacheles, or in this case a kisam, together with a shalheves, the shalheves becomes like a dover sheish bo mamish, because it's attached to the torch itself, to the piece of wood itself.
Right.
Mishnah says, "Hamotzi gacheles l'rshus harabim chayav v'shaleves patur." So Gemara asks the following kasha. We have a brayso of Atanya Motzi on Shabbos. If you carry out to Rishus Ram Shaleves Kolshu, the smallest amount of a flame, chayav, he violates meleches hotzah, and that's a direct contradiction to our Mishnah that says he's potter for carrying shaleves because the davar shein bo mamish. And the Gemara answers Rav Sheshes. Oh, this we did already. Kigon shahotzi b'keisa. Abai Omar, the shayfe mana mishcha the asle beinura. What he did was he took a utensil and he soaked it in oil, and then he lit a fire that oiled utensil, and he carries out this utensil, hopefully with gloves, l'rshus harabim, and since the shalheves is now attached to the kli, therefore he's chayav frotzas shalheves. And there's a long discussion here. Why didn't Abaye find Rav Sheshes satisfactory? Rav Sheshes says he was holding it in like a torch on a kisam. What does Abaye gain by dipping a vessel into oil and then lighting up the vessel? So based on Rashi, he says, Hatam shabaye miein b'teirutzo shel Rav Sheshes. Why did Abaye reject Rav Sheshes? Kisam mishum shabaye sovar shem hotziu kesam potur. Wow, what's the difference between a kesam and a vessel? Keman shedavar muatu umemayar li chavos. A kesam is so small, especially in this case, it's less than a shear, that it won't last very long. And therefore, and in this case, because he's carrying also the shalheves, if it's but if it's not going to last any long, it's what we call a malacha shein. So Abaye, therefore, she's going to keep the mishum mana, let him be chayav for carrying the utensil. What do I need the shalheves? And the Gemara answers bechaspa, that the utensil is made of pottery, of earthenware, a piece of cheres. So what? Typically mishum chaspa. Okay, fine. It's a piece of chaspa, but apparently the chaspa has a certain value to it, a certain chashivas to it. Why isn't he chayv otzah for carrying the cheres? Forget about the Shalheves. And the Gemara answers, "Bit less leishiura." That we're talking about a piece of cheres that doesn't have the minimum shear to be chai for Otzah Shabbos. This not, and the Mishnah Masechet Shabbos on Pei Beis establishes the shear. What's the minimum shear of cheres, of a shard, a piece of pottery, to be chai for Otzah? Kidei litain bein patzim lechavero. Okay, what is patzim? So I seem to remember patzim from Masechta Eruvin. Let's see if he says here that patzim are ptzimim. What are ptzimim? Okay, you told me what patzim are. Now tell me what ptzimim are. Koros eights, beams of wood that are used for construction. And they are very much used for the construction of windows, for window constructions. And they make a kind of a mashkov for the top of the window. How do you say mashkov in English, John? I'm just curious.
Door frame.
Door frame, okay.
Window frame. Frame.
A frame, okay. A mashkov is a frame. Fine. I need my help here for my interior design. Okay.
Best regards.
Okay. Now, what happens is that sometimes there's airspace between the patzim, from one pots to another pots. So what they do is they take small pieces of pottery and they fit it in to close up those gaps, so that a piece of pottery in its most basic value will serve to plug up these openings between the patzim, which is called litain bein patzim lechavero. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara now asks the following question. You've now told me that even though our Mishnah says Hamotzi v'Shalev is potter to Dover Shebo Mamish, but if he carries it through something else, like a kisam, or like a vessel, or in the third case, the cheres, then he's chayev also for the shalheves. How can you possibly carry a shalheves in motzi shalheves and you took it from one rishus to the other if it's not attached to something? I mean, I can't even imagine a person carrying a shalheves. And the Gemara answers, he has a fire that's burning in Rishus HaYachid, which is right on the border of Rishus HaRabim. And what he does is he blows on his hand, and the air that he blows disconnects the Shalheves from where it's connected in Rishus HaYachid, and it flies into Rishus HaRabim. And now he's chayav. He's chayav for being motzi the shalheves. I mean, is he chayav? And that's where the Mishnah addresses our case and says, no, he's potter. Why? Because the shalheves is the davar shein bo mamish. The only thing that bothers me here, and maybe Ira, you have a footnote that could help me. Why is there a havamina to be chayav? Where's the hanocha? You're never chayav for otzah without hanocha. How are you going to put down the shalheves by blowing it from one rishus to the other? That I can't figure out. Maybe it landed on some other object and took fire. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything about hana.
About hanocha? Nothing about hanocha. Okay,
No.
I'm going to have to assume it landed on something of significance and it didn't automatically just blow out in midair. Our Mishnah now that we're about to learn goes back to the din of Isa Tchumin with regard to a chayfetz that belongs to a person. And now we're going to talk about water in a cistern, either a privately owned cistern, a bar shel yachid, or a public cistern of water, a bar shel rabim, bar shel yachid, kiraglei hayachid. So the water can only be removed by someone else within the tchum of the owner of the water, not beyond. Vishal anshe osa ha'ir. What happens if you have a bar that is public and it belongs to the entire municipality? Then the tchum is kiragle anshe osa ha'ir. In other words, you're allowed to carry this water up until the point that you would be allowed, if you're a member of the city, to go to walk, meaning alpayim mama, up to 2,000 amma from the boundary, the outer boundary of the city. Shel ole bavel, with regard to ole bavel, what happened was people were making aliyah l'regel from Bavel during the Shalosh Regalim, and somebody who was very benevolent dug public burrows so that the Ole Bavel would have access to water, and they would drink it on their way to Yerushalayim. And what is the status of that water on Shabbos or Yontiv? Kiragle hamemale. Hell of a Mishnah. The Mishnah says it all depends on the person who filled up the bar. And that's where he was Kodesh Visa. And basically we view this bar as hefker. It's ownerless. Therefore, we cannot pin down the tchum to one particular owner. The best we can do is pin it onto the mamale. The male is the person who filled up the water personally. He was, in a sense, zochem in a hefker. This is water that doesn't belong to anyone, and therefore the tchum of this mayim is determined by ragle hamamale. And that means that even if he lends the water to someone else, that person is limited. He can only be molech. He can only carry the water until the point where it would be mutter. It would be permissible for the mamale himself to go, not beyond. 2 more minutes. So the Gemara says, Rami le Rava le Rav Nachman. Rava objects to Rav Nachman. Tanan, we have a Mishnah. Bar shal yachid kiragle yachid. That's how a Mishnah. Uriminu. I have a contradiction from a Beitza. The Beitza says, Naharos hamoshchim. You have river water that flows. They're not stagnant. They move from place to place. They're in motion. Another example would be Mayanos Hanovin. So you have spring water that comes from a spring, and in that case, we'll have to see. Again, this is a little bit more complicated, but it seems that at some point, the water that comes from the spring will stop in its place. Anyway, we'll get back to that a little bit later. As far as the Mayonos and the Naharos are concerned, Harei hein kiragle kol adam. In other words, you're not konesh visa in their makom. It's not dependent on the ragle abaylim, not even on the ragle mamale, because this is something that moves from place to place. And when you have a davar nayid nun yud dalid, which moves from place to place, ein lo shvisa. Now, if something doesn't have a shvisa, what does that mean? It means you're allowed to transport it and relocate it anywhere on the face of the globe? Ella, what it means is kol adam, any person who picks it up, is molichan kiragla. The tchum is determined by the person who scoops up the water. So we see from this price that water in general doesn't have shvisa, and therefore its status is always correct, because that Mishnah says, also yachid. So what exactly is the Gemara's steer over here? The Beitza doesn't distinguish between a case where the water belongs to a private owner or it's public in nature. We thought that in all likelihood, we're talking about a body of water that's public in nature, but that's not so. He's got water that flows or a spring in his own domain, in his private property. And if that be the case, our Mishnah says that the Mea Bar of a Yochid has the Tchum of Raglei HaYochid. And yet here it says, Harein Kiraglei Kol Adam. I mean, whoever picks it up, the bar, or in this case, the nar, is in private property belonging to Ruvain. And now we're saying that when Shimon picks up the water, he can be Kovea a Shvisa as if he acquired ownership of the water. Amar Rabba Hachmai Askinon. Here in our Mishnah, we're talking about a case of Mechunasim. This is water that was gathered together inside the cistern, inside the bar. It's not water that moves from place to place. And since the water is not moving from place to place, it has a shvisa. And who is going to determine the tchum of that shvisa? It's kiragle bala bar. It depends on the owner of the bar. V'yitmar nami, and that's also what we learn in the Beis Medrash. Amar Abchia bar Ovin, Amar Shmuel. Our Mishnah is talking about a case of mechunasim. But when you have water that travels from place to place, then it's kiragle kol adam. And that's not a contradiction to our Mishnah because our Mishnah is talking about mechunasim.
Okay, Shkoyach, sorry.
Okay, Shkoyach. Do you know by chance, because I don't know how to do this, how do I, is there a way of like just sort of stopping it?
Yeah, so go to the bottom again, press more, and there should be pause record.
I see security,
recording.
chat, enable original sound meeting, settings, and YouTube. That's what they give me.
That's all they give you, there's no more?
Yeah. All right. You know what? I'll try to manage the best
Okay. All right, be well.
as I can. Okay, then, Ira?
Yeah,
so
thank you very
everything
much.
you do, we'll try to get together next week on Sunday.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
All the best.
Take care.
All too. Bye-bye.
I'll do it.
So we have a principle here that kol davar nayid, whatever is in motion, like these rivers, is ein lo shvisa. It doesn't have a definite place for shvisa, and therefore its status is kol adam molicham kiragla. That means it's allowed to be moved and relocated according to the tchum of that person because the water is night. Now the Mishnah says regarding Meboros, Shel Ole Bavel Kiragle Hamamale. So you remember we spoke about the Ole Bavel. Itmar, we learned in the Beis Medrash. What do we learn about Mei Bar Shel Ole Bavel is kehefker, and therefore their din, the status is kiragle amamale. That's a case of mila liatzmo. But mila v'nosan lechavero, in a case where he drew water from the bar of the Ole Bavel for his friend, on behalf of his friend, he was working as an agent, and he gives the water over to his friend, that's a whole different discussion. What's the status of that water? Of Nachman Omer, according to what opinion? The Mayim is Kiragle Mishanis Malulo. We look not at the Shliach, the Mamale, but rather the Meshaleach, or shall we say the Zocher, the person on whose behalf he was Zocher in the water. So if he was Mamale, let's say Reuven for Shimon, then according to Rav Nachman, at least, everything depends upon Shimon. Even though the water never came to his hands, because the Mamale becomes the Shliach, and he was zoche in the mayim on behalf of Shimon. And therefore you're allowed to locate and move this water until the tchum of Shimon. Rav Sheshes Hamari disagrees. Kiragli Hamamale. Everything depends upon the shliach. The tchum is going to be the tchum of the mamale, the one who actually drew the water, not the ragle mishan ismale lo. The Maika Miflagi, the Gemara analyzes this machlok between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes. Mar Savar, according to Rav Sheshes, Bira, the cistern of Ole Bavel, de Hefkerahu, it's Hefker. And therefore, according to Rav Sheshes, the Mamale is Zoche on behalf of himself. He has the din of Tchum Mayim Kitchum Shalo. And the reason for that is because with regard to Hefker, we have a principle called Chav Lachrini. In other words, you don't say that you could be Zoche and Hefker on behalf of someone else. Why? Because if you're Zoche on behalf of someone else, then it's to the detriment of other people. Every person has a right to be Zoche and a Hefker. And the Gemara says, Umar Savabar of Nachman has a different opinion. Bira de Shutfeu. The bar of the Ole Regel is considered a bar shel Shutfim, not Hefker. The Bnei Agola were not mafkir this bar, but rather they gave it to any member of Klal Yisrael to be a shutaf, that he could be a partner in this bar. Anyone who fills the water from the bar is taking from his own private partnership ownership of that water. And therefore, when he tells his friend to be mamale on his behalf, that friend of his becomes his shliach, who's being mamale on his behalf from his chelek. So it's Ruvain sending Shimon, asking Shimon to be mamale. Shimon accepts the job, and he's mamale on behalf of Ruvain. And Shimon cannot be Zochem and Hefker as the mamale because the water belongs to private ownership of Ruvain who sent him. And therefore the din of the Tchumayim, according to the opinion of Rav Nachman, is Kitchum Mishan Ismalu Lo, the Mishaleach, not the Shliach. So Gemara immediately objects to Rav Nachman, Eisvei Rav Rav Nachman. We learned in the Mishnah in Dorim, Hareini Alecha Cherem. He asks his own moment on his friend, like Hegdesh, is Hamudar Asur. Only the one who is Mudar is Asur Lenos Min HaNoder, but HaNoder Mutar Lenos Min HaMudar. Because the Noder did not accept upon himself any Isur Neder. And here we turn to Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis for the Hemshech of the Mishnah.